name's Jackie Kay, and I wrote Red Dust Road several years after writing the adoption papers. The adoption papers came out in 1991, and then nearly 30 years later, Red Dust Road came out. And I suppose I think about Red Dust Road as being a loose sequel to the adoption papers, only the adoption papers, I kind of played around with the idea of my own life and made things up. The birth mother in that book was entirely imaginary. At that point I'd never found my birth father, so they existed very much in my imagination. By the time I came to Red Dust Road, I had actually found both of them, and the process of finding them was so extraordinary to me, and the real life situation so bizarre that it seemed like there was no point in making anything up, because the truth was, literally, as the cliche goes, stranger than fiction. So it was a case of me trying to take the truth and mediating it through some other form, and that form seemed to be memoir. It felt as if for the very first time my life was a story that was happening to me, and the story itself had its own momentum, and as if all of these different events that were happening to me, going to Nigeria, finding my birth father, finding him initially just by putting his name into Google, and up pop, because he's a leading ethnobotanist, he's a world tree specialist. So from the very beginning, tracing my family tree and finding this tree specialist father was already kind of totally bizarre thing, the kind of thing that if you put in a novel, nobody would believe you. They think, oh, that's far too far-fetched. So it seemed to me that memoir was the only form that I could write in, and I'd never written a memoir before, and it's just that the story did feel like it was happening to me. It's like I became a character in my own life. And I think that that's something that happens to people a lot, and whether they write or whether they don't write, and whether they're memoirists, diarists or not. I think that sometimes in your life, events are so shocking or traumatic or surprising to you that you step outside of yourself a little bit to try and understand them, and you for a moment become a character in your own life. And that probably is the best way that I can think of describing the process by which you arrive at writing a memoir. And whether you actually write it or whether it's just thoughts occurring to you, that's the process that happens. It's quite strange, but I think people recognise it, especially when people have been through grief or something strange. They kind of slightly step outside themselves, and there's two of them there, taking the experience in. I think that's a really interesting question, the notion that the themes in reality are somehow also in Red Dust Road, and in a way they are, because Red Dust Road is about trying to grapple with the reality after the imagination has been so much better. I mean, my imaginative version of my birth parents was probably more enjoyable than meeting them for real. And reality deals with people who are on the edge in one way or another, where the power of their imagination is the only thing in certain situations that helps them get through the day. There's an old woman in an old people's home who desperately wants a cherry red cardigan. The story's called These Are Not My Clothes. She's dressed in somebody else's clothes, and the thing that keeps her going is visualising herself, imagining herself in a cherry red cardigan. So all of my characters in reality are somehow questioning the notion of reality and using their imaginations in one way or another to get them through what is a kind of almost existential state of loneliness that I think the short story kind of encourages. I don't know why all my characters in my short stories are terribly lonely, but it seems like the form itself is a kind of kindred spirit to the emotion of loneliness.
It's a group of stories all trying to bond together to be friends.
Yes, exactly. I think it is probably a group of stories trying to give each other solace, comfort and company, and in some cases writing one story then prompted the writing of another. Much later on there's a character that appears, that had appeared in an earlier story, that appears in a later one and gets her own story. So there was a sense that the stories themselves are having a conversation with each other, a conversation about similar things. You know, what is the real world? What is our imagination? Is reality too much to bear? Is the reality formats, or are the reality formats that we watch all the time on reality TV shows, are they reality? Are they real? What is real? And it's a question that I think is really pertinent for us at these times when we have all sorts of different ways of recording our actions non-stop, tweeting ourselves on Facebook, constantly we have a constant technological version of ourselves, but is that us? are our tweets really us? I don't tweet, but for those that tweet, do they really reflect that non-stop documentation of time? So I'm kind of fascinated with the way that technology has changed our notions of reality, and that's what I'm concerned about in that book. I think I probably find the whole business of being a writer, in whatever genre, cathartic. I think that I find the business of trying to find the key, the right little key to open the door of the idea that you have at that moment, the exciting thing. I mean, it's like you set yourself lots of questions, and you're writing not so much to answer questions but to ask them, and the asking of the questions are like tiny little keys that appear in all sorts of different kinds of doors, and you're kind of going along trying to find the one that fits. And so I find the struggle for form, for which form suits which idea, itself a cathartic process, because in a sense when we write, we're searching to tell a story in a particular way, and to understand some question that we've asked ourselves, and in the kind of trying to ask more questions in the writing, that process itself is cathartic. The questions that you have to ask, and the questions that you hope your reader will ask. I mean, it's not really the writer's job to answer questions, but to ask them. Well, the National Poetry Competition is a competition that's been going for years and is run very efficiently by the Poetry Society. And what happens is every year there's several thousand entries for this competition. I think the year that I was judging there was about 20,000 entries. Each judge gets to see 2 of the poems, so 2/3 of the entries go out to each judge, to all these boxes round about Christmas, just before Christmas start arriving, and they're full of presents, and the presents are poems. But and it's rather daunting at first, because you just have boxes and boxes and boxes, and your anxiety is that you're going to miss the really good stuff. You can actually quite easily identify the not well written poems. You can identify them very, very quickly and very easily. A lot of them are kind of handwritten, or a lot of them have strange fonts, really peculiar fonts, or come in pink envelopes, or have kind of little stickers of giraffes on them, or whatever. And you can easily identify the very, very good poems, the truly excellent poems, because they kind of rise to the surface, like a perfect souffle. They sort of rise, and they don't wobble. They're just there they are. Well, they wobble a little, but the poems that are in between are the ones that are difficult, the ones where you can't decide, is this really brilliant, or is this is this not so brilliant? So it's a kind of a fascinating process, and then you all meet and you talk and you discuss, and that's the bit I like best, because the business of the boxes arriving to your own wee house is quite a lonely one, but the business of meeting and discussing the poems and deciding is fascinating. Well, all of the poems that we picked for the first 3 prizes and the 10 commended poems are all what we were looking for. For instance, say Zafir Cuniel's poem Hill Speak is a perfect example of the kind of poem that I was looking for. It's fresh, it's new. I hadn't quite heard that voice before. It writes about something quite complex, simultaneous language, coming from a mixed identity, and it grapples with time in a really interesting way, but at the same time as having these quite complex ideas, it's also very accessible, and really, really fresh. So these are some of the things that I look for in reading a poem. It doesn't need to be immediately accessible, because it's quite fun to be able to come back to it again and again, but it does need to have something startling about it, a sort of a fresh way of seeing, where you look at it, you listen to a line of it and you think, oh, that makes perfect sense, or where you can see the whole poem happening like a tiny film in your head. I think we're always asking every few years, has there been a resurgence in poetry? And I think we ask it, and I think is this a new renaissance? And I think the reason that we ask that question all of the time is because we're continually surprised and excited by how much is going on in the world of poetry, and how many people it affects, and how many new poets there are continually coming on the scene. It's a constant surprise, given that we live in a society and a culture that doesn't do that much really to promote or to help poetry, not in the way that it perhaps does with reality TV formats or the Great British Bake Off. You don't have the Great British Poetry Off on the telly, and you have hardly any poetry on television, and very little on the radio, and very little in mainstream culture. Yet still this passion for poetry persists. Still young people, old people, people from all different backgrounds, rich, poor, whatever, still they all flock to poetry. And still at a festival like this, at Cheltenham Festival where we are at the moment, you'll be surprised at the amount of people that turn up for poetry readings. I'm about to do a reading in a minute, there'll probably be nobody there because I've jinxed myself. 10 people will come to me, oh my God. What makes a wonderful bookshop is a sense that when you go in there, you feel like you're almost going home. The bookshelves themselves feel friendly, that there's a range of books, even in a small bookshop. My local bookshop, for instance, Cheltenham Bookshop in Manchester, is wonderful. All the staff are really friendly. They will order something that they haven't got and get it for you right away, because obviously they've got limited space in there. It's small, it's cosy. You can go in there with a little child. I went in there with a 2-year-old recently, and that little child will feel at home. You can go in there with your dog, and your dog will feel at home, and they'll give your dog a bowl of water. And they're extremely friendly and interested and love reading, and you can ask them all the time, what have you just read, that's good, and they will tell you something, and you'll come across somebody that you might not have otherwise come across. These to me are the qualities that make a great bookshop. I also like specialist bookshops or second-hand bookshops. So there's a great bookshop, Wenlock Books in Much Wenlock, which is fantastic, got a great poetry section, and they're also really, really interested in a great second-hand section. I like bookshops that have both second-hand and books that you can buy brand new.